There is a street in Amsterdam that, in the early 17th century, smelled of spices, salt, and fear. It was the Jewish quarter, a cluster of narrow houses, newly erected synagogues, and faces marked by invisible scars. The families living there had not arrived by choice. They had fled from bonfires lit in public squares in Lisbon and Madrid, fled from courts where confessing one's faith meant signing one's own sentence, fled from a Europe that, in the name of divine love, had turned torture into a sacrament. Among these families was one that carried the surname de Spinoza. Miguel de Spinoza, the father, was a merchant. He imported dried fruits, sugar, olive oil, products that crossed oceans on slow ships and arrived at Dutch ports covered in mold and hope. He was not a wealthy man, but he possessed something many envied: stability. Within the Sephardic community of Amsterdam, the de Spinozas occupied a respectable place. They attended the synagogue regularly. They contributed with donations. They obeyed the codes. They were, in every visible sense, an exemplary family. Baruch was born in November 1632, the second son of Miguel with his first wife, Hannah Deborah. The name Baruch in Hebrew means blessed, a name laden with expectation, a name that functioned almost like a prophecy, or, depending on the point of view, as a cruel irony of fate. The boy's childhood was marked by loss. Hannah Deborah died when he was still a child. Miguel remarried. The second wife also passed away. He married a third time. Brothers were born and died. Death circulated through the de Spinoza household with the naturalness of a routine visitor. Baruch grew up breathing mourning, and perhaps it was this early acquaintance with the fragility of existence that planted in him the first seed of philosophical restlessness. Because those who see death up close from an early age learn, against their will, that ready-made answers are rarely true. At the community school, the Talmud Torah, the boy revealed himself to be extraordinary, not just intelligent, disturbingly intelligent, the kind of student who makes the teacher feel uncomfortable because his questions do not seek confirmation, they seek understanding. And genuine understanding, by definition, does not respect boundaries. The rabbis taught the Torah as absolute truth. Every word, every comma, every space between the letters carried divine meaning. Questioning the text was not just inadvisable, it was dangerous. The Sephardic community of Amsterdam lived under permanent tension. They had just escaped the Inquisition. They knew from generational experience that the slightest fissure in orthodoxy could be exploited by external enemies. Doctrinal uniformity was not just a religious issue, it was a survival strategy. Baruch understood this, but his brain refused to cooperate. He read the sacred texts with surgical attention and noticed things that others preferred to ignore. Internal contradictions. Passages that described events occurring after Moses' death, supposedly written by Moses himself. Sections where the narrative voice changed inexplicably. Geographical descriptions that did not correspond to the alleged time of composition. Temporal references that pointed to distinct centuries compressed into a single account. None of these problems were unknown to scholars. Rabbis and commentators throughout the centuries had stumbled upon the same inconsistencies. The difference was that all, without exception, had found ingenious ways to circumvent them. Allegorical explanations, figurative interpretations, layers of esoteric meaning that, conveniently, resolved any contradiction at the cost of making the text so elastic that it could mean virtually anything. Spinoza was not satisfied with these interpretative acrobatics. For him, if a text requires constant mental gymnastics to seem coherent, then perhaps the coherence is not in the text. It is in the mind of those who desperately need it to be coherent. This perception, still embryonic, would become one of his most revolutionary contributions to the history of thought. The idea that biblical text should be analyzed like any other historical document, with the same tools, by the same criteria, without supernatural privileges, without sacred shielding. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Baruch was just a brilliant teenager, surrounded by masters who admired him, and who, simultaneously, were beginning to feel a discomfort difficult to name when they looked into those dark, overly attentive, overly penetrating eyes. At 16, 17 years old, Spinoza came into contact with an intellectual current that would change his life forever. The philosophy of René Descartes. The Netherlands was at that time the only corner of Europe where Cartesian ideas circulated with relative freedom. And when Baruch read that phrase for the first time, "I think, therefore I am," something ignited within him that would never extinguish. Descartes proposed that doubt was the legitimate starting point of all knowledge, that nothing should be accepted as true until subjected to the tribunal of reason, that faith, as comforting as it might be, did not constitute proof of anything. This approach was like oxygen to Spinoza's lungs. For the first time, he found a thinker who validated what he had been feeling since childhood. The intuition that accepting without questioning is not virtue, it is surrender. But Spinoza went beyond Descartes, much beyond. Because Descartes, after all, retreated. He used reason to doubt everything, but when it came to the crucial question, the existence of the absolute, he resorted to arguments that, under rigorous analysis, contained evident logical flaws. Descartes needed the absolute to exist in a specific way, compatible with Catholic doctrine, because he lived in France where contradicting Rome could cost one's head, literally. Spinoza did not have this restriction. He was already losing everything anyway. He already felt the ties to his community unraveling fiber by fiber. He already knew, with the cold clarity of someone who sees the inevitable, that the path of honest thought would lead him out of any institutional shelter. And he decided to follow that path. In the years leading up to his excommunication, Spinoza began to frequent intellectual circles outside the Jewish community. He conversed with liberal Christians, with freethinkers, with religious dissidents of all kinds. Not that he agreed with everyone, in fact he agreed with few. But he absorbed everything, every argument, every perspective, every other's mistake taught him something valuable about the limits and possibilities of human reasoning. Meanwhile, inside the synagogue, rumors grew. They said that the son of the de Spinozas was associating with bad company, that he questioned the divine origin of the sacred texts, that he doubted the immortality of the soul, that he did not believe in angels, that, and this was the most alarming of all, he saw no reason to consider the Jews a chosen people among all others. They tried to rescue him, offered him an annual pension if he agreed to maintain public silence and attend the synagogue regularly. They bargained. They pressured. They appealed to the memory of his father, who had passed away shortly before. Nothing worked, because Spinoza had already crossed a threshold from which there is no return. He had seen enough to know that going back would mean living a lie, and living a lie for him was the only true form of death, far worse than any punishment the community could impose. And so we arrive at that night in July 1656, at that synagogue door closing, at that young man walking alone through the streets of Amsterdam, without community, without family, without a safety net, carrying on his shoulders the weight of a freedom that very few human beings in history have had the courage to choose. He did not know that night that he would become one of the greatest thinkers of all time. He did not know that his work would influence Einstein, Goethe, Hegel, Nietzsche, Deleuze. He did not know any of this. He only knew that he needed to keep thinking, no matter the cost. And it cost almost everything. The document still exists. It can be consulted in the archives of the Sephardic community of Amsterdam. It is written in Portuguese, the official language of that congregation, and even separated from us by almost 4 centuries, its words retain a brutality that pierces the paper. The herem against Baruch de Spinoza, issued on July 27, 1656, is different from any other excommunication recorded in Jewish history. Not for the act itself, community expulsions happened with some frequency, but for the verbal violence employed. The leaders of the Talmud Torah congregation did not limit themselves to distancing a problematic member. They drafted a curse, a piece of ceremonial hatred so intense that it seems less a religious decree and more a scream of terror. Why so much fear? This question is rarely asked, and yet it is the key to understanding everything that came afterward. The rabbinical authorities of Amsterdam were not ignorant. They were not illiterate fanatics brandishing superstitions in a medieval village. They were cultured, sophisticated men, many of them educated in the best intellectual traditions of the Iberian Peninsula. They knew how to argue. They knew how to distinguish a teenage provocation from a real threat. And they recognized in Spinoza a real threat. Not because he shouted blasphemies, shoutings are easily dismissed, but because he spoke quietly, because he articulated his questions with a logical precision that made it almost impossible to refute them, without resorting to brute authority of "because the scriptures say so." And this answer, in the mind of Spinoza, sounded as convincing as explaining how a clock works by saying, "because the hand moves." The Harem declared that, after long investigation and extensive deliberation, the council decided to banish, separate, execrate and curse the aforementioned Spinoza, that no one should maintain oral or written communication with him, that no one should render him service, that no one should remain under the same roof, that no one should approach him within 4 cubits, about 2 meters, that no one should read any text composed or written by him. The invoked curses were exhaustive. The plagues described in the book of Deuteronomy were summoned against his name. The wrath and celestial fury would descend upon him. The full weight of tradition turned against a single 23-year-old individual whose crime consisted of thinking with radical honesty. There is one detail that many historians highlight. Unlike other excommunications, Spinoza's was never revoked. Even centuries later, when the entire world recognized his genius, the Jewish community of Amsterdam kept the Harem intact. Only in 2015, more than 350 years after the original issuance, did the chief rabbi of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam make a public statement suggesting that it might be time to reconsider, without, however, formally reversing the decision. 350 years, 3.5 centuries of institutional silence. If that doesn't demonstrate the extent of the fear that Spinoza provoked, nothing does. Now it is necessary to understand the context. The Sephardic community of Amsterdam lived in a precarious position, tolerated, not accepted, by the Dutch government. It depended on good conduct to maintain its privileges. Any intellectual scandal could serve as a pretext for civil authorities to revoke the permission for worship. Any appearance of radical heterodoxy could be exploited by political adversaries. Community leaders had practical reasons, in addition to theological ones, to fear Spinoza's ideas. But reducing the excommunication to a political calculation would be dishonest. There was genuine theological horror involved. The rabbis understood, better than many later philosophers, where Spinoza's reasoning was leading. If the biblical texts are not of divine origin, if they can be analyzed as human documents, if they contain errors, contradictions, and late interpolations, then rabbinical authority does not rest on any transcendent foundation. The masters do not speak in the name of the Most High. They speak in their own name, invested with an authority that they themselves fabricated. And if this applies to Judaism, it applies to any religion on the planet. Spinoza did not need to say this out loud. The implication was contained in every line of his thought, like poison dissolved in crystal-clear water. After the excommunication, Spinoza went through a period that biographers describe with few sources and much speculation. It is known that he abandoned the name Baruch, which was Hebrew, and began to use the Latin version, Benedictus, the same meaning, blessed, but in a language that did not belong to any community that had rejected him, a universal language, a language that belonged to thought, not to tribe. He moved to the vicinity of Leiden, then to Rheinsberg, then to Voorburg, and finally to The Hague. Each move represented a deeper step into isolation and, paradoxically, into freedom. Without institutional ties, without community obligations, without external expectations shaping his behavior, Spinoza could finally do what his mind had demanded since adolescence: think without chains. The trade of lens grinder, which he adopted as his livelihood, was not accidental. There was a poetic irony, perhaps conscious, perhaps not, in this choice. A man dedicated to seeing with absolute clarity earned a living making instruments of vision. The lenses he shaped equipped telescopes and microscopes, tools that precisely at that time were revealing to humanity that the universe was incomparably larger and more complex than any scripture had described. And now, before proceeding, I need to take a pause. Not in the story, in our relationship. You have come this far. You are walking alongside a young man exiled through the streets of a cold Holland, following the steps of someone who gave up everything to pursue an idea. This says something about you. It says that you are not satisfied with surfaces, that you seek the layer beneath the layer, that you hunger for something that most people do not even know exists. So let me ask you something. If you were in Spinoza's place, if you knew that the truth you carry within you would cost you your family, your community, your security, would you go ahead? Or would you turn back? Write in the comments, I want to know. Not an automatic response, not a reflex. I want to know what you would really do if the truth required you to lose everything. And if this story is making sense to you, if it is igniting something that other content does not ignite, subscribe to the channel now. Because what we are building here is not disposable entertainment. It is a journey. And every person who joins this circle strengthens the idea that thinking is still worth it. Having done that, let's continue. Because the most extraordinary part of this story has not even begun. Back to Spinoza. Imagine the scene. A small room, perhaps 5 meters by 4, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, a work table covered with optical instruments, glass discs in various stages of polishing, cloth stained with abrasive, delicate wires. Next to it, another table, this one covered with papers, stacks of sheets filled with tiny, meticulous, almost obsessive handwriting. Each sheet numbered, each paragraph labeled as a mathematical proposition. This is how Spinoza lived. This is how he worked. By day, his hands shaped glass. By night, his mind shaped concepts, two activities that for him possessed the same essence, removing the excess until only pure clarity remained. The Ethics, full title, Ethics Demonstrated in the Manner of Geometers, did not emerge all at once. It was composed over more than a decade, compulsively revised, restructured multiple times. Spinoza did not write as one expresses opinions. He wrote as one builds a bridge. Each piece needed to support the weight of the following ones, and any fragility at one point would compromise the entire structure. The method he chose is, in itself, a declaration of principles. He organized the work exactly as Euclid had organized the elements of geometry 2,000 years earlier. Definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, scholia. Each statement was logically derived from the previous ones. Nothing was assumed without justification. Nothing was accepted by tradition, authority, or emotional convenience. This formal choice was not a stylistic whim. It carried a devastating implicit message. The truth about the absolute does not belong to the domain of faith. It belongs to the domain of reason. If something is truly true, then it can be demonstrated with the same rigor that we employ to demonstrate that the internal angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. And if it cannot be demonstrated in this way, then perhaps it is not as true as we would like to believe. Let's start with the foundation. Spinoza opens the Ethics with a set of definitions. The most important, the one that supports the entire edifice, is the definition of substance. In technical philosophical language, that which exists in itself and can be conceived by itself without depending on anything else to exist or be understood. Translating into accessible terms, substance is that which simply is. It was not created by anything. It does not depend on anything. It does not need an external cause, external support, or external reference. It exists by necessity of its own nature, just as a circle is round by necessity of its own definition, not because someone decided it should be round. From this definition, Spinoza constructs a chain of reasoning whose conclusion is simultaneously simple and dizzying. There can only be one single substance, and this substance is infinite. And this substance is what we traditionally call the absolute. The argument, condensed to its maximum, works like this. If there were two distinct substances, they would need to differentiate themselves by some attribute. But substance, by definition, is that which contains within itself all possible attributes. Therefore, there can be nothing outside it that limits or differentiates it. If something seems to be outside, it is actually inside. It is a manifestation, a mode, an expression of this unique substance. In more direct terms, everything that exists is part of a single absolute reality. Every stone, every cloud, every thought, every emotion, every galaxy, infinite variations of the same thing. There is no separation between creator and creature. There is no abyss between spirit and matter. There is no dividing line between sacred and profane. Everything is one thing, manifesting in infinite forms. And here comes Spinoza's most famous phrase, the Latin expression that synthesizes all his metaphysics in 3 words, Deus sive natura. Translation, the absolute, that is, nature. These 3 words functioned like an intellectual earthquake, because what Spinoza was saying, with all the geometric calm in the world, was that the absolute and nature are the same thing. Not similar, not analogous, identical. Calling the universe God or calling God the universe produces exactly the same result. They are 2 names for a single reality. Think about the implications. If the absolute is nature, then there is no act of creation. The universe was not manufactured by an external intelligence that, at a certain moment, decided there should be light, water, earth, animals, and human beings. The universe simply exists, has always existed, will always exist, because existence is the very essence of substance. Asking who created the universe makes as much sense as asking who created the number 2. The number 2 was not created. It is a logical consequence of the structure of mathematics. Similarly, the universe was not created. It is a necessary consequence of the nature of the real. If the absolute is nature, then there is no providence. No intelligence supervises events, distributing rewards for the obedient and punishments for the rebellious. Earthquakes are not divine punishments. Abundant harvests are not heavenly prizes. Diseases are not tests of faith. Everything that happens because the laws of nature so determine, with the same necessity that a billiard ball moves when struck by another. If the absolute is nature, then there are no miracles. A miracle, by definition, would be a violation of natural laws operated by a higher will. But if the absolute is nature, then natural laws are the laws of the absolute. Violating these laws would be equivalent to violating oneself, an impossible logical contradiction. An infinitely perfect being cannot contradict its own essence. Therefore, miracles are, by definition, impossible. Each account of a supernatural event in the scriptures is either a misinterpretation of natural phenomena or a deliberate invention to impress credulous minds. If the absolute is nature, then there is no life after death, at least not in the personal sense that religions promise. There is no paradise waiting for the righteous. There is no hell awaiting sinners. There is no reincarnation, no posthumous judgment, no cosmic tribunal where our actions will be weighed on a mystical scale. When the body dies, the particular configuration of matter and thought that constituted that individual dissolves, returns to the infinite substance from which it emerged, just like a wave returns to the ocean. The wave disappears, the ocean remains. Each of these conclusions by itself would be enough to provoke the fury of any religious institution. Together, they formed a systematic demolition of practically everything that organized religions teach as fundamental truth. And the most disturbing part, Spinoza did not argue with anger. He did not write with resentment. There was no sarcasm in his propositions, just an unyielding calm, almost cold, that made each conclusion even harder to swallow. Because it is easy to dismiss someone who is furious. Someone furious may be wrong for emotional reasons, but how to dismiss someone who speaks with the serenity of someone reading an equation? Spinoza's ethics does not only deal with the absolute. If it were just that, it would be a work of metaphysics, important no doubt, but distant from everyday life. Spinoza's genius lies in having taken his vision to its most intimate consequences, to where it hurts, to where thought touches flesh. The second part of the work addresses the nature of the human mind, and here Spinoza does something that neuroscience would only come to confirm 3.5 centuries later. He destroys the separation between mind and body. In the 17th century, the dominant view was Cartesian. Descartes had divided reality into 2 substances, res cogitans, the thinking thing, the soul, the spirit, and res extensa, the material thing, the body, matter. Mind on one side, body on the other, like a pilot inside a machine. This division was extremely convenient for religion, as it allowed for the assertion that the soul, being immaterial, survived the destruction of the body. The death of the organism did not mean the death of the person. There was something inside us, something ethereal, untouchable, divine, that transcended matter and continued to exist forever. Spinoza looked at this dualism and realized it was unsustainable. If mind and body are distinct substances, how do they interact? How does an immaterial thing, without extension, without location, without physical properties, manage to move a body of flesh and bone? Descartes suggested that the interaction occurred in the pineal gland, a tiny structure in the center of the brain. Spinoza considered this answer absurd, and rightly so. Naming the location of interaction does not explain the mechanism of interaction. It is like answering, "How does electricity work?" by saying, "in the outlet." Spinoza's solution was radical and elegant. Mind and body are not two things. They are one thing, perceived in two different ways. The body is the mind seen under the attribute of extension, matter, form, movement. The mind is the body seen under the attribute of thought, ideas, sensations, emotions. There is no ghost in the machine. There is a single reality expressing itself simultaneously as body and as mind, just as a coin has two faces without being two coins. This intuition, formulated by Spinoza in the mid-17th century, was only taken seriously by science at the end of the 20th century. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, in his book In Search of Spinoza, extensively argued that contemporary discoveries about the relationship between emotion, cognition, and body confirm, in empirical terms, what Spinoza had deduced through pure reason. The mind does not float above the body like a cloud. The mind is the body thinking, and the body is the mind acting. But if mind and body are the same thing, then one consequence imposes itself with overwhelming force. Free will is an illusion. Here Spinoza enters the most uncomfortable territory of his philosophy, the point where many people instinctively recoil. The argument works like this. Every thought that crosses your mind is caused by a previous thought, which in turn was caused by another, in an unbroken chain that extends to infinity. Similarly, every event in your body is caused by a previous event in an equally unbroken chain. As mind and body are one thing, these two chains are actually one single chain. Everything you think, feel, and do is the necessary result of causes you did not choose. You do not decide your thoughts and they emerge. You do not decide your emotions, they burst forth. You do not decide your actions. They inevitably result from the conditions that precede them. The feeling of freedom, that intimate impression that I could have done differently, exists only because we are unaware of the causes that determine us. We are like a stone thrown through the air that, if it could think, would believe it is flying by its own choice. Spinoza used exactly this image, a thrown stone aware of its movement, but ignorant of the hand that launched it. The natural reaction to this idea is rejection. No one likes to hear that their decisions are not really theirs, that the feeling of personal sovereignty, I choose, I decide, I control, is a fiction produced by ignorance of the causes. It is disturbing. It threatens the foundation upon which we build our identity, our morality, our legal system, our personal relationships. Spinoza knew this, and he did not back down, because for him, recognizing the absence of free will was not a condemnation, it was a liberation. If people do not choose to be who they are, then it makes no sense to hate them for what they do. If the criminal did not decide to commit the crime, if he was determined to do so by an infinite chain of causes that include his genetics, upbringing, experiences, circumstances, then the appropriate response is not revenge, it is understanding. It is not blind punishment, it is transformation of the conditions that produce the behavior. This view, in the 17th century, was almost inconceivable. The entire theology depended on free will. Without it, there is no sin. Without sin, there is no guilt. Without guilt, there is no need for redemption. Without the need for redemption, there is no need for church. The entire chain of institutional justification collapses like a house of cards when the first piece is removed. And Spinoza removed that piece with the same calm with which he polished a lens. The third part of the ethics dives into human emotions, and here the work reaches a psychological depth that rivals any modern treatise. Spinoza catalogues and analyzes dozens of affective states: joy, sadness, desire, love, hate, hope, fear, jealousy, pride, humility, remorse, compassion, not as manifestations of an ethereal soul, but as variations of a fundamental principle, the conatus. Conatus is the basic impulse of every existing thing to persevere in existence. Each being, each organism, each configuration of matter instinctively struggles to continue being what it is. This force is not added from outside. It is constitutive. It is part of the essence of each thing, just as the shape is part of a triangle. In the human being, the conatus is manifesting as desire, and it is from desire that all emotions unfold. Joy is what we feel when our capacity to exist and act increases. Sadness is what we feel when that capacity diminishes. Love is joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Hatred is sadness accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Each emotion, no matter how complex it may seem, can be traced back to this elemental dynamic of increase or decrease in the power of existence. The beauty of this analysis lies in the total absence of moral judgment. Spinoza does not classify emotions as good or bad, virtuous or sinful. He does not say that anger is wrong or that compassion is mandatory. He simply describes the mechanism. He maps the human affective territory with the same objectivity with which a cartographer maps a mountain range, without opining whether the mountains should be taller or shorter. And it is precisely this objectivity that allows for something extraordinary. Instead of combating emotions with guilt, as religions do, or with repression, as conventional morality does, Spinoza proposes that we understand them. Because an understood emotion loses its blind power. It does not disappear, but it ceases to drag us along like an underground current. It becomes visible, navigable, transformable. This approach, treating emotions as natural phenomena to be studied, not as inner demons to be exorcised, is the foundation of modern cognitive psychology. Spinoza formulated it 350 years before any neuroscience laboratory. If the previous block mapped the territory of emotions, this one dives into the question that really matters. Why, even knowing what harms us, do we continue to do it? Why do we repeat destructive patterns? Why does the person who swears never to smoke again light the next cigarette? Why does someone who promises to leave a toxic relationship return? Why does humanity, even endowed with reason, live in seemingly endless cycles of conflict, exploitation, and self-inflicted suffering? Spinoza dedicated the fourth part of the Ethics to this question. The title he chose says it all: on human servitude, or on the strength of affects. Servitude, not slavery imposed by an external tyrant. Self-imposed servitude, the condition of one who is governed by internal forces they do not understand, and precisely because they do not understand them, cannot resist. We are slaves not to iron chains, but to emotional chains, and these are infinitely harder to break because we do not even see them. Spinoza's diagnosis is surgical. Human beings suffer because they confuse what is partial with what is total. We live immersed in a fragmented perspective. We see pieces of reality, scraps of events, slices of experience, and we build complete narratives from these fragments. We believe we understand the situation. We believe we know why something happened. We believe we dominate the scenario. And, in the overwhelming majority of cases, we are completely mistaken. Spinoza called this type of knowledge first kind, knowledge by vague experience and by signs. It is the way most people operate in their daily lives. We form opinions based on superficial impressions, on third-party accounts, on emotional associations that crystallized during childhood. We confuse correlation with causation. We attribute intentions where there is only chance. We interpret others' behavior by projecting our own fears and desires. And, on this shaky foundation of accumulated misconceptions, we erect our convictions, our judgments, and our decisions. The result is predictable: suffering, not because the universe is cruel, not because a punitive deity has condemned us to pain, but because we operate with an incorrect map. And those who navigate with an incorrect map inevitably collide with reality. Think of a concrete example. A person is betrayed by someone they trusted. The pain is real, intense, excruciating. Up to that point, nothing abnormal. Pain is a natural response to the decrease in the power of existence. The problem begins when this person constructs a narrative from the pain. I was betrayed because I am insufficient. I was betrayed because the world is evil. I was betrayed because you can never trust anyone. Each of these narratives is a hasty generalization based on a specific event. And each of them, once established as truth, begins to contaminate future decisions, creating a cycle of distrust, isolation, and new suffering. Spinoza would say that the betrayal itself is not the main problem. The problem is the inadequate interpretation. The person confuses a particular event with a universal law. They transform a painful experience into a permanent sentence about the nature of the world. And this confusion, this illegitimate leap from the particular to the general, is the root of emotional servitude. There is another mechanism that Spinoza identifies with almost painful precision: the tyranny of imagination. For him, imagination is not a benign creative faculty. It is the main instrument of servitude. The human mind has the capacity to evoke images of absent things as if they were present. We can fantasize about a glorious future or ruminate over a traumatic past with a vividness that, for the body, is almost indistinguishable from real experience. The problem is that these imagined images produce real emotions. Fantasizing about a future danger generates anxiety now. Ruminating over a past humiliation generates anger now. Idealizing a distant person generates desire now. The body reacts to the creations of imagination as if they were concrete facts, because from a physiological standpoint, the distinction is irrelevant. The brain activates the same circuits, the same hormones, the same bodily responses, regardless of whether the stimulus is real or imagined. And so we live, trapped between memories that no longer exist and projections that have yet to happen, rarely present in the only moment we truly have, the now. Spinoza anticipated centuries in advance the diagnosis that contemporary psychology and even certain Eastern contemplative traditions have formulated. The main source of human suffering is the inability to inhabit the present. But Spinoza goes beyond the diagnosis. He identifies why this inability is so persistent. The reason, he argues, is that reason itself is a weak emotion. Knowing that something harms us is not enough to prevent us from doing it. Intellectual knowledge alone does not move human beings. What moves us are affects, emotions with enough intensity to alter the state of the body. And an abstract idea, smoking kills, rarely has effective intensity comparable to the concrete urgency of an immediate desire. I need a cigarette now. This analysis is devastatingly honest, and it explains why moral sermons, religious commandments, and New Year's resolutions fail so regularly. Telling someone, "Don't do that," is useless if the impulse that drives the action is stronger than the understanding that should prevent it. Abstract reason is a candle in front of an emotional gale. So are we doomed? Is servitude permanent? Spinoza answers no. But the way out is not where most people expect to find it. It is not in the repression of affects, because repressing an emotion merely pushes it underground, where it continues to operate out of the reach of consciousness. It is not in passive resignation, because accepting suffering as fate is just another form of ignorance. And it is definitely not in obedience to external commandments, because obeying without understanding keeps servitude intact, merely swapping one master for another. The way out, for Spinoza, lies in the transformation of knowledge itself. It is not enough to know. It is necessary to understand. Understanding is not storing information. It is integrating information into the body, into effects, into lived experience. When someone truly understands why they act in a certain way, when they see the causes with the same clarity with which they see an object before their eyes, this understanding in itself alters the emotion. It does not eliminate it. It transforms it. It converts a passive affect, where we are dragged, into an active affect, where we act from understanding. This distinction between passivity and activity is central in the ethics. We are passive when the causes of our action are outside of us, when we react to external stimuli without understanding them. We are active when the cause of our action resides in our own understanding, when we act because we understand, not because we were pushed. Freedom, for Spinoza, is not the absence of determination. It is the presence of understanding. We are not free when we do what we want, because we often want things that destroy us. We are free when we understand why we want what we want, and in that understanding, we become capable of wanting differently. The fifth and final part of the Ethics is probably the most beautiful passage that Spinoza composed. After 4 sections dedicated to dismantling illusions, about the absolute, about the mind, about emotions, about human servitude, he finally erects something in their place. Not a new temple, not a new dogma, something much rarer, a path. The title of this part is On the Power of the Intellect, or on Human Freedom. And from the first proposition, the tone changes. There is a silent urgency in these pages, as if Spinoza, who already knew he was gravely ill, who felt his lungs giving way a bit. More each winter, he wanted to concentrate in these last demonstrations everything he considered most vital. The central argument is this: the highest form of freedom consists in understanding oneself as part of infinite nature, not as a separate being, looking at the universe from the outside, not as a subordinate creature, kneeling before a distant creator, but as an expression, a specific, temporary, unrepeatable wave of the boundless ocean that constitutes the totality of the real. When someone reaches this understanding, not just intellectually, but lived, felt in the body and in emotions, something extraordinary happens. Fear loses its meaning, not suddenly like someone taking a magic pill, gradually like someone who slowly gets used to seeing in the dark. Because what are we afraid of, after all? Death? If we are expressions of an infinite substance, individual death is merely the dissolution of a particular form. The substance remains. The ocean does not diminish when a wave dissolves. The fear of death is, ultimately, the fear of losing what we never possessed, a separate, independent, self-sufficient identity. An identity that, according to Spinoza, never truly existed. And loneliness? If each being is a manifestation of the same infinite fabric, then the separation between I and other is an operational illusion. Useful for navigating daily life, we need to distinguish bodies so we don't bump into each other, but ontologically false. At the deepest level of reality, there is no boundary between you and the rest of the universe. The feeling of radical isolation that haunts so many people corresponds to nothing real. It is an artifact of limited perspective and suffering. Spinoza does not deny that pain exists. He does not propose any philosophical anesthesia. He recognizes that bodies get sick, bonds break, expectations are frustrated. The difference lies in the relationship with suffering. Those who understand that everything that happens necessarily follows the laws of nature, that no event is personal, that the universe does not conspire against anyone, suffer the pain without adding to it the additional layer of outrage, injustice, of why me? And this additional layer, argues Spinoza, is often more devastating than the original pain. There is a concept in the ethics that synthesizes all this in a luminous way, the intellectual love of the absolute, amor intellectualis Dei in Latin. Spinoza defines it as the joy that arises when the mind understands itself and the universe as expressions of an infinite and eternal substance. It is not worship, because worship implies distance between the worshipper and the worshipped. It is not submission, because submitting implies a will superior to which we bow. It is recognition. The mind recognizes its own nature as a conscious fragment of the whole, and in this recognition, it experiences a serenity that Spinoza considers the highest form of happiness accessible to human beings. Note that this is not about faith. It is not necessary to believe in anything. There is no supernatural revelation involved. The intellectual love of the absolute arises from understanding, from the rigorous, disciplined and honest exercise of reason taken to its ultimate consequences. It is, paradoxically, the most profoundly spiritual feeling one can conceive, and it arises entirely within the limits of rationality. This fusion of reason and spirituality, of logic and beatitude, is perhaps Spinoza's most original contribution to the history of thought. Before him, reason and spirituality were treated as opposing domains. Thinking was one thing, feeling the sacred was another. The philosopher occupied one margin, the mystic the opposite margin. Spinoza demolished this barrier. He showed that the most rigorous thought, taken to the end, necessarily leads to an experience that can only be described as sacred, even without a temple, without ritual, without intermediary. There is a passage in the final Scholia of the Ethics where Spinoza writes that beatitude is not a reward for virtue, but virtue itself. We do not achieve happiness because we are good. We are good because we achieve happiness, the happiness that comes from understanding. We do not obey moral rules to receive a reward in the future. Understanding is, in itself, the reward. The path and the destination merge. Compare this with the moral structure of any organized religion. Do good now, receive the reward later. Obey now, gain paradise later. Suffer now, be compensated later. Always a transaction, always a contract between the faithful and the Most High, mediated by an institution that proclaims itself the procurer of the sacred. Spinoza eliminates the transaction, eliminates the contract, eliminates the mediator. What remains is a direct relationship without intermediaries between the finite mind and the infinite reality of which this mind is a part. And in this relationship, there is no place for fear. There is no place for guilt. There is no place for bargaining. There is only understanding. And from understanding, naturally, springs what religions call love, but which, in Spinoza's language, is simply the joy of existing, knowing what one is. The famous final sentence of the Ethics summarizes everything in one sentence. Everything excellent is as difficult as it is rare. Spinoza knew that his path was not for everyone, not out of elitism, but out of honesty. The understanding he proposes requires effort. It requires the willingness to abandon comfortable beliefs. It requires the courage to look at reality without the protective filters that culture, tradition, and human psychology naturally construct. Few are willing to do this. And Spinoza does not blame them. Those who understand universal determination do not blame anyone for anything. But for the few who are willing, for the rare ones who feel the urgency to know instead of just believe, he left a complete roadmap, a kind of map of the inner territory, drawn with the precision of someone who dedicated an entire life, sacrificed everything he had, and faced alone the hostility of the entire world to trace every curve, every relief, every abyss, and every peak of this invisible landscape we call human existence. If the Ethics was Spinoza's secret cathedral, built in silence, kept under lock and key, meant to be known only after his death, the theological political treatise was the grenade he threw in broad daylight. Published anonymously in 1670, 7 years before his death, the treatise is a work of completely different nature. While the Ethics addresses pure reason, the treatise speaks to the real world, to politics, to institutions, to the mechanisms of power that use religion as a tool for social control. If the Ethics is a monologue of a solitary genius conversing with eternity, the treatise is a direct intervention in the affairs of its time, and, by extension, of ours. The book was published without an author's name and with a fictitious publisher supposedly based in Hamburg. Necessary precautions. Anyone publishing that content under their own name would be signing an invitation to imprisonment. And even with all these precautions, the book was quickly identified as the work of Spinoza and banned by the Dutch authorities in 1674. The central argument of the treatise can be summarized in a few lines, although its implications extend for centuries. The Bible is not a philosophical or scientific text. It is a moral and political text, written by human beings in specific historical circumstances, directed at a specific audience, using figurative language adapted to the intellectual level of that audience. Treating it as a source of factual truth about the nature of the universe is a categorical error. It is equivalent to reading an Aesop fable, expecting to find accurate information about animal anatomy. Spinoza did not formulate this thesis as a gratuitous provocation. He arrived at it through a method that today we would call historical biblical criticism, which, in the 17th century, simply did not exist as a discipline. He was the first thinker to systematically propose that sacred texts be analyzed with the same tools applied to any historical document. Who wrote it? When? For whom? In what context? With what intention? Applying this method to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible traditionally attributed to Moses, Spinoza reached conclusions that, for the time, sounded like dynamite. Moses did not write the Pentateuch. Various passages describe events that occurred after Moses' death, refer to him in the third person, and use linguistic expressions incompatible with the period in which he supposedly lived. The text is evidently a late compilation of diverse sources, edited and re-edited over centuries by anonymous redactors. The miracles narrated in the scriptures are not factual accounts. They are rhetorical devices intended to impress poorly educated populations. The prophets were not spokespersons for a transcendent intelligence. They were men endowed with extraordinarily vivid imagination, who, unable to distinguish their inner visions from external reality, sincerely believed they were receiving celestial messages. Spinoza does not accuse them of deliberate fraud. He attributes to them a cognitive confusion between imagination and perception, a confusion perfectly understandable given the intellectual limitations of the time. The election of Israel as the chosen people reflects no divine preference. It merely reflects the historical and political conditions that allowed the survival of the Hebrew nation throughout the centuries. Other peoples, in similar circumstances, could claim the same status with equal legitimacy or equal lack thereof. Each of these assertions in itself would be enough to ignite 17th century Europe. Gathered in a single volume, they constituted an unprecedented intellectual arsenal against the political use of religion, because that was, at its core, the real target of Spinoza, not faith itself, but the instrumentalization of faith by political power. He saw with absolute clarity how rulers and clerics operated in symbiosis. The clerics provided the theological justification for obedience, obey because the Most High commands it. The rulers, in return, guaranteed the clerics privileges, incomes, and immunity. One fed the other in a cycle that kept entire populations in a state of voluntary submission. And the key to that submission was precisely superstition. As long as people believed that sacred texts contained literal truth, as long as they feared supernatural punishments and aspired to post-mortem rewards, they would remain docile, obedient, manipulable. Superstition, for Spinoza, was not an innocent side effect of ignorance. It was a tool of domination, perhaps the most efficient ever invented, because it operated from within. It did not need external chains. The chain was in the mind of the prisoner, and he called that chain faith. The solution that Spinoza proposes is a radical separation between religion and state, and the absolute guarantee of freedom of thought and expression. At that time, this proposal sounded almost lunatic. No European nation operated under such a principle. The idea that the state should not impose religious beliefs, that each individual possessed the inalienable right to think and express their opinions without institutional coercion, was as strange to the common sense of the time as it would be today to propose the abolition of money. And yet it is precisely this principle that underpins contemporary liberal democracies. The separation between church and state, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, the idea that no government has jurisdiction over the thoughts of its citizens, all of this, which we today treat as elementary civilizational achievements, was first formulated with argumentative rigor by an excommunicated lens grinder living in a rented room in The Hague. The theological political treatise is, in many ways, the birth certificate of political modernity. Not because Spinoza invented the idea of tolerance alone, other thinkers contributed before and after, but because no one, before him, had dismantled with such precision the mechanisms by which religion becomes an instrument of oppression and proposed so clearly the alternative. A secular state where reason, not revelation, serves as the ultimate criterion of social organization. Jefferson read Spinoza. Locke debated with his ideas. The architects of the French Enlightenment cited him as a precursor. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen carries in each article the invisible shadow of that lens grinder who, a century earlier, had written that no earthly power has the right to dictate to the individual what they must believe. And most notably, Spinoza did not argue for freedom of thought as an abstract or sentimental right. He argued for efficiency. A state that represses intellectual freedom is, in the long run, doomed to stagnation, because without free thought there is no innovation. Without innovation there is no adaptation, and without adaptation there is no survival. Freedom of thought is not a humanitarian luxury. It is a biological necessity of human societies. Pure pragmatism, without emotional appeal, without romanticism, the same cold objectivity that runs through the entire ethics, and perhaps for that very reason, so difficult to refute. The 1670s were simultaneously the most productive and the most painful period of Spinoza's life. The mind functioned with an almost feverish intensity, finishing the ethics, drafting the political treatise, which would remain unfinished, maintaining extensive correspondence with intellectuals across Europe, formulating treatises on Hebrew grammar and optical theory. The body, however, followed an inverse trajectory. With each passing year, breathing became a little more difficult. Each Dutch winter robbed him of a little more lung capacity. The cough, which had previously been occasional, became a permanent companion. The glass dust was doing its silent work. Spinoza had been living in The Hague since 1670, staying at the house of the painter Hendrik van der Speyk. He rented a simple room upstairs. He would come down for meals, when he came down. Often he would send for a plate of soup and bread to be brought up to him, because he was too busy writing to interrupt his work. Van der Speyk recalled years later that his tenant was the calmest man he had ever known. He would spend entire days without leaving his room. He did not receive many visitors. He did not drink. He did not smoke a pipe, ironic considering what his lungs were already suffering. The only vice, if it could be called that, was thought. Despite the anonymity sought, Spinoza's fame spread. The theological political treatise, officially banned, circulated in clandestine editions throughout Europe. Copies disguised with false covers, innocuous titles about medicine or natural history, passed from hand to hand among university students, diplomats, and curious aristocrats. Spinoza had become what every established power fears most, a voice that cannot be silenced because it reproduces faster than it can be confiscated. Illustrious figures sought his contact. The diplomat and secretary of the Royal Society, Henry Oldenburg, maintained regular correspondence. The philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who would become one of the greatest thinkers of the century, personally visited Spinoza in The Hague in November 1676. They talked for several days. Leibniz never publicly acknowledged the depth of the influence Spinoza had on his thought. To do so would be to contaminate himself with the cursed reputation. But his private notebooks, discovered much later, reveal extensive notes on Spinozist arguments, treated with a respect that violently contrasts with his public statements of distance. This duplicity was standard. Practically every European intellectual of the late 17th century who came into contact with Spinoza's ideas reacted the same way. Private fascination, public rejection. The name Spinoza functioned as a reputational acid. Touching it dissolved careers. Bayle, Malebranche, Arnaud, first-rate philosophers wrote pages and pages refuting Spinoza with a vehemence that, paradoxically, attested to the impossibility of ignoring him. In 1673, Spinoza received an offer that would test his principles in a concrete way. Karl Ludwig, Elector Palatine, invited him to take the chair of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. The proposal included a generous salary and the promise of total academic freedom, with one caveat. The professor was expected not to disturb the officially established religion. Spinoza declined. Politely, but without hesitation. In a letter that became famous, he explained that any promise of intellectual freedom conditioned on not disturbing the official religion was, by definition, a contradiction in terms. If genuinely free thought would inevitably disturb established beliefs, and Spinoza knew better than anyone that it would disturb, then the condition nullified the promise. Better to remain free and poor than comfortable and gagged. The last months were difficult. The winter of 1676-1677 punished the Netherlands with severe temperatures. For someone with compromised lungs, the cold air was a sentence. Spinoza coughed more and more. He lost weight to the point that his few visitors were alarmed by his cadaverous appearance. Still, he continued writing. The political treatise progressed, a work where he intended to apply to the theory of the state the same principles that ethics had applied to metaphysics and morality. He did not manage to finish it. On February 21st, 1677, a Sunday, Hendrik van der Spyk and his wife went to church as usual. Spinoza stayed in his room, accompanied by the Dr. Lodewijk Meyer, a longtime friend. When the van der Spyks returned in the early afternoon, Meyer was waiting for them downstairs. Benedictus de Spinoza had passed away, quietly it seems, like someone finishing a sentence and laying down the pen. 44 years. He did not reach 45. The inventory of his belongings was brief: modest clothes, some polishing instruments, a small collection of books, and, the most valuable item, a bound manuscript containing the final version of the Ethics, along with the unfinished drafts of the political treatise and other minor texts. His friends acted quickly. Within a few months, the collection of manuscripts was published under the title Opera Posthuma, without the author's name on the title page, only the initials BDS. The authorities reacted with predictable speed. The book was banned almost immediately in the Netherlands and in several other European territories, a ban that, as often happens, functioned as involuntary propaganda. Each decree of prohibition sharpened curiosity. Each confiscation generated demand for new copies. Spinoza's ideas infiltrated Europe like water through cracks, impossible to contain, indifferent to borders, fueled by the very pressure that sought to repress them. Leibniz, who had visited Spinoza months before his death, sought to distance himself publicly. He declared that their conversations had been superficial, that he deeply disagreed, that he had never been influenced. The private notebooks tell another story. But Leibniz was too astute to take risks. He had a career to protect, patrons to please, a reputation to maintain. The spectre of Spinoza was too radioactive to be embraced in public. What followed was one of the most curious episodes in European intellectual history. For nearly a century, Spinoza's name functioned as a synonym for everything that the philosophical and theological establishment considered dangerous. Spinozism became a generic insult, an accusation that could be thrown at any thinker whose ideas were unsettling. To call someone a Spinozist was equivalent to calling them an atheist, subversive, and enemy of the social order, all at once. Most of the accused hurried to deny the label, and in denying it, they involuntarily confirmed the power of the ideas they rejected. Only at the end of the 18th century, with the so-called pantheism controversy in Germany, did Spinoza begin to be rehabilitated. Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi revealed that the great poet and philosopher Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, shortly before his death, had confessed in private conversation, "I am a Spinozist." The revelation shocked the German intelligentsia. If Lessing, one of the icons of the German Enlightenment, was secretly a Spinozist, then perhaps Spinoza was not the monster that everyone pretended to abhor. The floodgates opened. Goethe, the greatest writer of the German language, openly declared his intellectual debt. Schelling incorporated central elements of Spinozist metaphysics into his system. Hegel, despite occasional criticisms, recognized in Spinoza the unavoidable foundation of all modern philosophy. The entire German Romanticism, Novalis, Schleiermacher, the Schlegel brothers, was contaminated by the Spinozist virus. Spinoza had been dead for over a century. His bones rested in an anonymous grave in the Nieuwe Kerk in The Hague. Anonymous because, it seems, the body was buried in a mass grave, without an identifiable tombstone. And yet each generation of thinkers found itself compelled to confront his ideas, to accept them or reject them, never to ignore them. In the 19th century, the influence expanded beyond philosophy. Marx absorbed Spinoza's critique of superstition as a tool of social control. Nietzsche, although diverging on crucial points, recognized in Spinoza a solitary precursor of his own struggle against slave morality. George Eliot translated the Ethics into English. The poet Shelley carried a copy of the theological political treatise on his travels. In the 20th century, Einstein solidified the definitive rehabilitation. When a rabbi asked him via telegram if he believed in the Most High, Einstein replied with a phrase that traveled the world. "I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings." With this single statement, the most famous physicist on the planet conferred upon Spinoza what 3 centuries of persecution had failed to destroy: public legitimacy. If the man who deciphered the structure of space-time revered that exiled lens polisher, then perhaps, just perhaps, it was worth listening to him. And it is. Because everything that Spinoza wrote about the nature of the real, about the relationship between mind and body, about the origin of emotions, about the illusion of free will, about the destructive power of superstition, about the vital necessity of freedom of thought. Each of these theses has become more relevant, not less, with the passage of centuries. Neuroscience confirms his intuitions about the inseparability of mind and body. Cognitive psychology validates his analysis of emotions as natural phenomena. Contemporary political theory operates on foundations that he laid. Quantum physics, with its vision of an interconnected universe, where the observer and the observed merge, echoes in sophisticated mathematical language what Spinoza formulated in geometric language 3.5 centuries ago. A man alone in a cold room, polishing lenses to survive, writing truths that no one wanted to hear, and that the entire world eventually found itself compelled to listen to. There are more impressive legacies in the history of human thought, but few are as improbable as this one. There is a dimension of Spinoza that the Ethics, by its formal nature, does not reveal. The masterpiece is a cathedral of propositions, cold, symmetrical, relentless. Those who read it without context may imagine that its author was a kind of logical machine, devoid of affection, incapable of humor, immune to the turbulence that afflicts common mortals. The letters completely disprove this image. Spinoza's correspondence, partially preserved as many letters were destroyed by him or by fearful recipients, constitutes an intimate portrait of a deeply human man. In the letters, the voice changes. The geometer gives way to the conversationalist. The propositional coldness melts away, revealing beneath it someone who was irritated by silly objections, who laughed at pompous adversaries, who showed generous patience with sincere interlocutors and cutting impatience with the dishonest. One of the most revealing exchanges occurred with Willem van Blijenberg, a Calvinist merchant from Dordrecht. Blijenberg wrote to Spinoza in 1664 after reading the treatise on the reform of the understanding, expressing admiration and requesting clarification on the nature of evil. The correspondence that followed, 7 letters from each side, illustrates in miniature the insurmountable chasm between 2 ways of thinking. Blijenberg reasoned within the parameters of Reformed theology. He accepted the scriptures as literal truth. He assumed that the absolute possessed will, plan, and purpose, and within this framework, the question of evil was genuinely distressing. Why does an omnipotent and benevolent being allow suffering? Spinoza responded patiently in the early letters, trying to explain that, in his view, evil does not exist as an independent entity. What we call evil is merely a deprivation, the absence of something, not the presence of something. Just as darkness is not a substance but the absence of light, evil is not a force, but the absence of understanding. No one does evil deliberately. They do what seems to them the best course of action given their constitution and circumstances. The error lies in limited perception, not in malignant intention. Blijenberg could not absorb the argument. Each of Spinoza's responses generated new objections, not because the logic failed, but because the conclusions clashed with premises that Blijenberg refused to abandon. If evil does not exist as an autonomous force, then sin loses substance. If sin loses substance, redemption becomes unnecessary. If redemption is unnecessary, the entire Calvinist edifice collapses. In the 7th letter, Spinoza ended the correspondence. without aggression, but with firmness. He explained that the conversation had become unproductive because the two were starting from incompatible premises. Bleisenberg accepted revelation as a primary source of truth. Spinoza accepted only reason. Between these two starting points, there was no possible bridge, only the illusion of dialogue. This epistolary exchange illustrates something fundamental about the Spinozist method. He does not debate, he demonstrates. A geometric theorem does not submit to a vote. The sum of the angles of a triangle is not negotiable. Either you follow the demonstration and accept the conclusion, or you reject the initial axioms, and in that case, the conversation ends before it begins. Another notable correspondence involved Henry Oldenburg, Secretary of the Royal Society of London. Oldenburg was an intermediary between Spinoza and the English scientific world, a kind of cultural agent who facilitated intellectual exchanges across borders. The letters between the two cover an impressive variety of topics: optics, fluid mechanics, the nature of infinity, the composition of bodies, the meaning of the resurrection of Christ. In this last question, Oldenburg pressed Spinoza repeatedly. He wanted to know if the philosopher believed in the literal resurrection, because without it, Christianity lost its foundation. Spinoza responded with calculated diplomacy. The resurrection, he said, should be understood allegorically. Christ rose from the dead in the sense that his ethical message transcended the destruction of his body. The truth he taught remained alive after his execution. That was the resurrection that mattered, not the physical reanimation of a corpse which contradicted all known natural laws. Oldenburg became visibly uncomfortable. He insisted. Spinoza maintained his position without wavering. The correspondence cooled after that, resumed years later in a more cautious tone, like between two former friends who had learned to avoid the subject that divided them. There are also the letters exchanged with Albert Berg, a young Dutchman who had converted to Catholicism with the characteristic fervor of the newly converted. Berg wrote Spinoza an extensive and condescending letter, urging him to abandon his deplorable errors and embrace the true faith before it was too late. The tone oscillated between genuine pity and the involuntary arrogance of someone who believes they have found the only truth and feels sorry for those who remain in darkness. Spinoza's response is one of the sharpest pieces of all philosophical literature. Without raising his voice, at least not on paper, he dismantled each of Berg's arguments with almost cruel precision. He asked him how he knew that the Catholic Church possessed the truth if each religion makes the same claim with equal conviction. He asked him if Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists were all equally blind, or if perhaps, only perhaps, Berg's absolute certainty about his own faith was as unfounded as each of theirs about theirs. He finally asked him whether the grandeur of Catholic temples, the pomp of rituals, and the extent of ecclesiastical power constituted proof of truth, because if they did, then the pagan Roman Empire with its even grander temples should be considered even more true. Berg did not respond. Or if he did respond, the letter was lost. He probably did not respond. There are questions that function like doors locked from the inside. Those who do not want to leave do not find the key. The letters also reveal a Spinoza, concerned with practical issues, that ethics, due to its abstract altitude, does not address. He frequently discussed politics, the conflicts between the Orangist Party and the Republican Party in the Netherlands, the wars against France and England, the assassination of the De Witt brothers in 1672. This last event deeply shook him. Johann and Cornelis de Witt, leaders of the Republican Party and advocates of religious tolerance, were lynched by an enraged mob in The Hague, the city where Spinoza lived. Their bodies were publicly mutilated. According to reports, Spinoza was so disturbed that he wanted to take to the streets with a sign denouncing the barbarity. His landlord, Van der Spik, locked the door of the house to prevent him, probably saving his life. This episode dispels any fantasy that Spinoza was a hermit disconnected from the world. He felt. He suffered from brutality. He was indignant about injustice. The difference is that he channeled these emotions into thought, rather than dissipating them in impulsive gestures. Ethics was not written by someone insensitive to human suffering. It was written by someone who understood suffering so deeply that he sought, with all his intellectual capacity, to find a permanent way out instead of a temporary relief. There is a delightful irony in Spinoza's legacy. The man who was accused of destroying religion ended up involuntarily predicting science. This is not a superficial coincidence. When physics, biology, and neuroscience advanced enough to formulate genuinely profound questions about the nature of the real, they found, repeatedly, disconcertingly, answers that Spinoza had already outlined 3 centuries earlier. Not with the technical precision of experimental science, of course, but with a structural intuition so accurate that scientists of the caliber of Einstein, Damasio, and many others felt compelled to acknowledge the debt. Let us begin with physics. The Spinozist view of the universe as a single substance, where everything is interconnected and nothing exists in isolation, finds a direct parallel in quantum mechanics. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement, where 2 particles separated by astronomical distances behave as if they were one, responding instantaneously to changes experienced by the other, challenges the classical intuition of separate objects interacting at a distance. It suggests instead that separation is apparent, that at a fundamental level the universe operates as an indivisible whole. Spinoza would have smiled at these discoveries. Not out of intellectual vanity, everything indicates that he was genuinely devoid of vanity, but because they confirm the central premise of ethics. The separation between things is an artifact of human perception, not a property of reality. We cut the world into distinct objects because our senses operate that way. But the world, in itself, has no seams. It is continuous fabric. Einstein's general relativity reinforces this perspective from another angle. By demonstrating that space, time, matter, and energy are not separate entities, but distinct manifestations of the same geometric reality, curved spacetime, Einstein provided in mathematical language what Spinoza had formulated in philosophical language. Substance is one. The distinctions we perceive are modes, not essences. It is therefore not surprising that Einstein invoked Spinoza so explicitly. The parallel is not forced, it is structural. Let us move on to biology. The theory of evolution by natural selection, formulated by Darwin in the 19th century, is incompatible with the notion of intentional creation, but perfectly compatible with the Spinozist view of a nature that unfolds according to internal laws, without external purpose, without prior design, without teleology. Species arise, transform, and disappear, not because a celestial architect decrees it, but because environmental conditions favor certain configurations over others. Nature does not plan, it operates. It does not choose, it selects. It does not judge, it filters. The Spinozist conatus, that fundamental drive of each being to persevere in existence, finds a direct echo in Darwinian fitness. Each organism struggles to survive and reproduce, not by conscious decision but by constitutive necessity. Life wants to continue living, not because someone ordered it to want to, but because wanting to continue living is the very definition of being alive. Spinoza did not know Darwin. Darwin, in turn, did not read Spinoza, or if he did not cite him. But both arrived by distinct paths at the same fundamental conclusion: nature is self-explanatory. It does not require an external agent to justify its processes. It operates by immanence, not by transcendence. The laws are within it, not above it. In neuroscience, the parallel is even more impressive. Antonio Damasio, the Portuguese neuroscientist based in the United States, dedicated an entire work, In Search of Spinoza, to demonstrating that contemporary discoveries about the relationship between body, emotion, and reason confirm, in experimental terms, what ethics had deduced through purely rational means. Spinoza's insistence on the unity of mind and body, his categorical refusal to accept Cartesian dualism, is now consensus in neuroscience. No serious researcher maintains that the mind is an immaterial entity floating above the brain. The mind is what the brain does. Thoughts are patterns of neural activity. Emotions are bodily states represented in the nervous system. The separation between mental and physical is a linguistic convention, not a real boundary. The Spinozist analysis of emotions as variations of conatus increases or decreases in the capacity to act, corresponds to what affective neuroscience describes as states of activation and deactivation of reward and aversion circuits. Joy, in neuroscientific vocabulary, is the activation of dopaminergic circuits associated with approach and behavioral expansion. Sadness is the activation of circuits associated with withdrawal and contraction. The language has changed, the structure remains identical. The discovery that seemingly rational decisions are profoundly influenced by emotional states, that, without emotion, reason alone is incapable of producing functional choices, directly echoes the Spinozist analysis of the impotence of abstract reason in the face of affects. Damasio documented patients with lesions in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region associated with emotional processing, who, despite maintaining intact logical capacities, became incapable of making minimally functional decisions in daily life. They knew how to reason, but could not act. Because acting requires impulse, and impulse is affect. Spinoza knew this. He wrote about it. He demonstrated it with axioms and propositions 350 years before any functional magnetic resonance imaging. There is also the question of free will. Contemporary neuroscience, especially after Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s, has accumulated disturbing evidence that conscious decisions are preceded by unconscious neural activity. The brain decides before the person is aware of having decided. The feeling of free choice, the "I decided now," arrives with a delay, like a posthumous narration of something that has already happened in the neural background. These findings are controversial, nuanced, and still debated. But the general direction points to what Spinoza stated unambiguously. The freedom, as we normally conceive it, the ability to genuinely choose either of two options, regardless of any prior determination, probably does not exist. What exists is complex causal determination, of which we have only partial awareness, and which we mistakenly interpret as freedom. The stone thrown through the air that believes it flies of its own will. Spinoza's metaphor, written by candlelight in the 17th century, remains to this day the most elegant illustration of a phenomenon that experimental science is gradually confirming. 3.5 centuries separate Spinoza's desk in The Hague from the electronic device on which you are receiving these words. In that interval, humanity invented electricity, discovered the structure of the atom, walked on the moon, decoded the genome, built digital networks capable of connecting billions of minds instantaneously. The world has changed in ways that Spinoza himself would be unable to imagine, and yet the fundamental problems he identified remain intact. In some cases, they have worsened. Superstition has not disappeared. It has changed form. In the 17th century, it manifested as belief in miracles, demons, literal prophecies. Today, it manifests as conspiracy theories, viral pseudoscience, industrialized misinformation. The underlying mechanism is identical, human beings operating with incorrect maps of the real, confusing correlation with causation, attributing intention where there is chance, building totalizing narratives from decontextualized fragments. Spinoza diagnosed this mechanism with a precision that seems addressed to our time. Superstition, he wrote, arises from fear. When people feel helpless in the face of circumstances they do not understand, they resort to explanations that offer a sense of control, even if these explanations are false. It is preferable to believe in a malevolent conspiracy than to accept that the world operates according to impersonal processes, indifferent to our desires. The conspiracy at least presupposes someone in charge. Chance presupposes nothing, and that is unbearable for a mind that has evolved seeking intentional patterns in every shadow. The instrumentalization of faith by political power, the central theme of the theological political treatise, has not lost relevance either. In various regions of the planet, political leaders continue to invoke divine mandates to justify earthly agendas. The rhetoric has changed. Few openly speak of theocracy, but the structure remains. Use the beliefs of others as leverage to obtain obedience and protect that belief from any rational questioning, because questioning it is to question the power it supports. Spinoza would respond to this scenario exactly as he responded to that of his time. Not by combating faith with militant atheism, he was never an atheist in the conventional sense, but by combating ignorance with understanding. The antidote to superstition is not disbelief, it is knowledge. It is not about forcibly tearing beliefs from people, like pulling a tooth, a painful procedure that often generates furious resistance. It is about offering a type of understanding so satisfying, so illuminating, so internally coherent, that previous superstitions fall away by themselves, like dry bark from a tree that continues to grow. The issue of mental health, a theme that Spinoza never formulated in these terms, but which permeates all his analysis of human servitude, has acquired epidemic urgency in our century. Rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion are reaching unprecedented levels in societies that, paradoxically, have more material comfort than any previous generation. Spinoza offers a surprisingly current explanation. We suffer because we live governed by passive affects, emotions whose cause we do not understand, and which therefore drag us along without our consent. We suffer because we confuse imported desires, from culture, advertising, social media, with genuine desires. We suffer because we build our identity around unstable things, the approval of others, material accumulation, social status, which by nature are incapable of providing lasting satisfaction. The Spinozist solution remains the same. Understand oneself as part of a whole. Understand that the search for happiness in external objects is structurally doomed to failure, not due to a cosmic curse, but due to categorical error. Happiness is not something that is acquired out there. It is something that is recognized in here, when the mind reaches sufficient clarity to perceive its own nature, as a conscious fragment of an infinite reality. This perspective does not solve all problems. Spinoza never promised a panacea. But it offers something that may be more valuable than any specific solution, a framework. A way of looking at existence that, instead of amplifying suffering with additional layers of guilt, fear, and self-condemnation, reduces it to its natural dimension. Pain exists. It is part of the functioning of finite organisms in a universe governed by impersonal laws. But pain without understanding generates torment. Pain with understanding generates, paradoxically, a strange and profound form of serenity. The dilemma of technology and digital surveillance also finds an echo in Spinoza's writings. The theological political treatise argues that the state can regulate actions. No society functions without laws that delineate behaviors, but never thoughts. The attempt to control what citizens think, believe, or feel is not only tyrannical, it is futile. Thoughts do not obey decrees. Publicly repressing them only pushes them underground, where they ferment and radicalize. Transposed to the contemporary context, this analysis sheds uncomfortable light on digital surveillance systems that monitor not only actions but opinions, preferences, ideological inclinations. Spinoza would argue that such systems, besides being morally unacceptable, are counterproductive. By suppressing the free expression of thought, they do not eliminate thought. They only make it invisible, and therefore uncontrollable. Freedom of expression, for Spinoza, was not a dispensable luxury in times of crisis. It was precisely the opposite. The greater the crisis, the more indispensable freedom of thought becomes, because without it, society loses the ability to diagnose its own problems. An organism that anesthetizes its pain receptors does not become healthier. It becomes incapable of identifying the disease that is killing it. It would be comforting to say that hostility toward Spinoza was confined to the 17th century, that, with the advancement of science and democracy, his ideas were gradually accepted and incorporated into the common intellectual heritage of humanity, that today, in the 21st century, the lens polisher from The Hague has finally found his deserved place in the pantheon of great thinkers. The reality is more complicated. Spinoza continues to provoke visceral resistance, not in the same way as in his time. No one issues herem against him or burns his books in public squares, but hostility persists, transmuted into more subtle forms and, for that reason, more difficult to confront. The first source of resistance is religious, and it is the most obvious. Contemporary theologians from various confessions continue to treat Spinozism as an active threat, not because they believe that their congregations will rush to read the Ethics, most have never heard of the book, but because Spinoza's conclusions, if taken seriously, delegitimize the very function of institutional religious authority. If the Absolute has no will, does not issue commandments, does not choose peoples, does not send prophets, and does not care about rituals, then what is the purpose of a priest? What is the purpose of a temple? What is the purpose of tithes, offerings, pilgrimages, confessions, baptisms, circumcisions, ritual fasts? The Spinozist answer, they serve no purpose from the standpoint of the relationship with the Absolute, is existentially devastating for any institution that derives its authority, funding, and social power precisely from these practices. It is not surprising, therefore, that Spinoza's name continues to be pronounced with discomfort in theological seminars and divinity schools around the planet. The second source of resistance is philosophical, and it is more subtle. Within the academic tradition itself, Spinoza occupies a strange position. He is universally recognized as one of the giants of Western thought, cited alongside Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel. But unlike these others, he is rarely taught in depth. Introductory philosophy courses dedicate weeks to Descartes, weeks to Kant, weeks to Hegel, and often reserve for Spinoza 1 or 2 classes, treating him as an appendix of Cartesian rationalism instead of recognizing him as an autonomous and radically original system. The reasons for this relative marginalization are multiple. Part of the problem is stylistic. The geometric form of the Ethics intimidates readers unaccustomed to logical formalism, creating a barrier to access that Descartes, with his accessible French, and Kant, despite the complexity embedded in a robust pedagogical tradition, do not impose to the same degree. Part is institutional. Philosophy departments are, like any human institution, sensitive to trends and intellectual fashions, and Spinoza has not always been in vogue. But there is also a deeper resistance that no teacher will openly admit. Spinoza is too disturbing. His conclusions are so radical, so uncompromising, so averse to middle grounds, that taking the Ethics seriously forces the reader to confront questions that most people, including professional philosophers, prefer to keep in comfortable suspension. Do we not have free will? Are all religions wrong about the nature of the Absolute? Is individual death merely the dissolution of a transient form? Does conventional morality rest on misconceptions about human nature? Each of these conclusions, if genuinely absorbed, transforms the way a person lives. And genuine transformation is something that most people, and most institutions, resist with all their might. The third source of resistance is personal, and perhaps the most powerful of all. Spinoza demands something that very few human beings are willing to offer: radical honesty with oneself, not social honesty, the kind that prevents us from lying in public. Inner honesty, the willingness to examine one's own beliefs, fears, and desires with the same impartial rigor that one would apply to a geometry problem, and to discover in that examination that many of the things one believes cannot withstand 2 minutes of logical scrutiny, that the fear of death carried since childhood is based on a mistaken conception of personal identity, that the anger felt toward a certain person is, in fact, a projection of dissatisfaction with oneself, that the pride cultivated regarding one's achievements ignores the infinite chain of causes, genetic, environmental, cultural, accidental, that made those achievements possible. This type of self-examination is not pleasant. It does not produce the instant satisfaction of a mystical revelation or the temporary euphoria of a religious conversion. It produces something much rarer and much less spectacular: clarity. A clarity that does not console, it illuminates. That does not anesthetize, it awakens. That does not promise anything, it delivers everything. There is an aspect of Spinoza's life that rarely receives the attention it deserves: loneliness. Not as an accidental circumstance, but as a constitutive element of his existence and thought. Spinoza was, in almost every sense that matters, a solitary man. and this solitude shaped his philosophy as much as any proposition in the ethics. After his excommunication, family ties were severed. His sister Rebecca tried to prevent him from receiving his paternal inheritance, and according to records, Spinoza contested it legally not for the money, which he eventually donated back, but for principle. He wanted to demonstrate that he had a legal right to what the community denied him by religious decree. He won the case. He renounced the inheritance, and he never had significant contact with his family again. He did not marry. He had no documented children. He did not establish any lasting affectionate relationship that biographers have been able to identify with certainty. There are speculations, a possible affection for the daughter of his Latin teacher, Franciscus van den Enden, but no concrete evidence. Spinoza's intimate life remains to a large extent an opaque territory. What we know is that he maintained a small circle of intellectual friends, Lodewijk Meyer, Jarek Jelles, Simon de Vries, Jan Ruerts, who admired him deeply and who, after his death, would take on the task of publishing his works. De Vries, in particular, offered him a lifelong income of 500 florins a year, which Spinoza refused. He accepted only a modest sum after prolonged insistence, reduced to 300 florins at his own demand. This systematic refusal of material comfort was not religious asceticism. Spinoza did not believe that poverty was a virtue, or that the body should be mortified in the name of the spirit. It was something different, a practical understanding that material dependence generates social obligation, and social obligation limits intellectual freedom. Accepting money from a patron meant implicitly owing something to that patron, attention, gratitude, eventually concessions. And concessions were precisely what Spinoza refused to make. The price was high. Living with almost nothing, in a rented room, eating frugal meals, wearing simple clothes without any luxury. This in itself was not new. Many thinkers lived in poverty. The difference, in Spinoza's case, was the lucid awareness that this poverty was chosen. With each offer refused, each chair declined, each invitation rejected, he reaffirmed a decision that could have been different. He could have been a professor in Heidelberg. He could have been a pensioner of some enlightened prince. He could have lived with more comfort, more recognition, more human warmth. He chose not to do so. And here lies one of the most uncomfortable lessons of his biography. Genuine freedom of thought has a real cost. It is not free. It is not obtained without sacrifice. Human society operates on the basis of belonging. We belong to families, communities, institutions, nations, and each belonging carries with it a set of tacit expectations. Thinking freely often means disappointing those expectations, and disappointing expectations often means losing belonging. Spinoza paid this price in full, and the question that his life poses to each of us is neither abstract nor rhetorical. To what extent are we willing to think for ourselves, knowing that thinking for ourselves may cost us what we value most, the approval of others? Most people answer this question with a comfortable evasion. I think for myself, yes, but without radicalism. Translation: I think for myself up to the point where my thinking does not threaten my belonging. Spinoza would consider this response understandable. After all, the conatus of each being compels them to preserve their social existence as much as their biological existence. But he would not consider it free, because freedom that stops at the limit of others' discomfort is not freedom. It is diplomacy. Spinoza's solitude was not only the price of his freedom, it was also the portal to his deeper understanding. Because only in the absence of social noise, of expectations, obligations, identity performances, can the mind hear itself clearly enough to perceive what normally lies submerged beneath layers of cultural conditioning. Spinoza did not recommend solitude as a way of life. He was not a hermit preaching isolation. He recognized in the ethics that human beings are more powerful when they cooperate, that society, when well organized, enhances individual capacity to exist and act. But he also recognized that poorly organized society, based on superstition, fear, and blind obedience, does the opposite. It diminishes individual capacity, compresses thought, standardizes souls. To live in society without being devoured by it, to participate in the world without being enslaved by its opinions, to love people without depending on their approval. These tensions, which Spinoza lived in the flesh, continue to be the central challenges of any existence that aspires to something beyond mere conformist survival. There is a temptation, when concluding a narrative about a great thinker, to embalm him in bronze, to turn him into a statue, to fix him in the past as a consummate historical figure, someone who lived, thought, died, and whose ideas now rest on library shelves, catalogued and archived, available for occasional consultation but essentially inert. Spinoza resists this treatment. He resists because his ideas do not belong to the past. They belong to that rare intellectual territory that, the more time advances, the more contemporary it reveals itself to be. The ethics does not age, not because it is sacred. Spinoza would detest that categorization, but because it deals with such fundamental structures of reality that historical circumstances become irrelevant. Gravity does not age. Logic does not age. The demonstration that substance is one and infinite does not age. It traverses centuries with the same freshness with which it came from the pen of its author. But there is something more, something that goes beyond simple intellectual longevity. Spinoza did not finish, not in the trivial sense that the political treatise was left unfinished when death interrupted him. In a deeper sense, the Spinozan project remains incomplete because no isolated mind could complete it. The task that Spinoza began, to understand the entire reality through reason without appealing to any external authority, is, by nature, infinite. Each generation that takes it up advances a little further, but never reaches the end, because the object of understanding is itself infinite. Neuroscience advances in the direction that Spinoza pointed, mapping the relationships between body, emotion, and thought with increasing resolution. But it is far from having exhausted the subject. Theoretical physics moves towards increasingly unified models of reality, strings, fields, exotic geometries, but has not reached, and perhaps never will reach, a final equation that encompasses all questions. Behavioral and cognitive psychology refines each decade its understanding of the effective mechanisms that Spinoza catalogued in the third part of the Ethics. But each answer generates 10 new questions. Spinoza planted seeds. Some germinated in his time. Many germinated centuries later. Others, perhaps, have not yet germinated. And it is precisely this incompleteness that makes his legacy so vitally different from that of a religious prophet. A prophet delivers finished truths, closed, defined. The faithful do not need to continue thinking, they just need to obey. Spinoza's legacy works in the opposite direction. It does not deliver final answers, it delivers a method, a way of questioning, a discipline of thought that each person can and should apply for themselves, to the questions of their own time, to the circumstances of their own life. The Ethics is not a catechism. It is an invitation. An invitation to do with your mind what Spinoza did with his, to take it to the limits of its capacities, without fear, without reverence to external authorities, without the cowardly break of, "This is too complicated for me." Because if there is something that Spinoza's life demonstrates above any philosophical proposition, it is this: an ordinary human being, not a demigod, not an enlightened one, not a chosen one, armed only with their reason, their honesty, and their willingness to pay the price of freedom, heirs capable of touching truths that the greatest institutions on the planet have spent millennia trying to monopolize. You do not need an intermediary to access the real. You do not need a priest. You do not need a guru. You do not need a sacred book. You only need what you already possess, a mind capable of asking why, and the courage not to stop until finding the answer. Spinoza showed that this is possible, not in theory, in practice, with his own life, at the cost of his own solitude, in the silence of his own room. And if a lens grinder from the 17th century, excommunicated, sick, poor, and alone, managed to see what entire empires refused to see, then what is stopping us? We have reached the end of this journey. Or, more precisely, to the point where this particular journey ends, because the true journey, the one that matters, begins now. It begins when you close this video and return to the world, to your work, to your relationships, to your fears and desires, to your concrete life, with all its contradictions, all its pains, all its beauties. Spinoza did not write to be admired from a distance. He wrote to be used. The ethics is not an object of contemplation. It is an instrument, a telescope pointed inward, a precision tool intended to do with the human interior what the microscopes and telescopes he polished did with the external world, to make visible what was hidden. Let us recap the essentials. There is a single reality, infinite, eternal, that manifests in infinite forms, as matter, as thought, as emotion, as light, as gravity, as life, as death. Calling it absolute or calling it nature produces the same result. There is no separation between the divine and the mundane. Everything participates in the same substance. You are part of that substance. Not an isolated part, not a disconnected fragment, but a temporary and unrepeatable expression of the infinite whole. Just as a wave belongs to the ocean without ceasing to be a wave, you belong to the real without ceasing to be you. Your individuality is real, but it is not absolute. It is a mode, a particular and transient configuration of the eternal substance. Your emotions follow laws as rigorous as the laws of physics. They are not random whims of a fickle soul. They are determined responses to specific causes. Causes that, when understood, lose the power to drag you like an underground current. An understood emotion does not disappear, but transforms. It ceases to be a prison and becomes information. The suffering that exceeds raw pain, existential anguish, fear of death, the feeling of emptiness, corrosive guilt, arises in its overwhelming majority from interpretative misunderstandings, from wrong maps, from confusions between the partial and the total, between the imagined and the real, between imported desire and genuine desire. Correcting these misunderstandings does not eliminate pain. Finite organisms will always feel pain, but it eliminates the torment we add to pain out of ignorance. Freedom is not doing what one wants. It is understanding why one wants what one wants, and in that understanding, opening the possibility of wanting differently, not out of coercion, not out of moral duty, not out of fear of punishment, but out of inner clarity. No institution holds the monopoly on truth. No book is infallible. No priest has privileged access to the real. Reason. This simple yet extraordinary capacity to ask why and demand coherent answers is the only instrument that every human being carries with them from birth. Using it fully is a right. Renouncing it is the deepest form of servitude. Spinoza knew that this path was difficult. He knew it was rare. He knew that most people would prefer the comfort of ready-made truths to the hard work of autonomous understanding. He did not judge them for that. Those who understand universal determination do not judge anyone. But for the few who feel deep within themselves the urgency to know, not to believe, not to repeat, not to obey, but to know, he left a map. Imperfect, like every map. Incomplete, like every human work. But drawn with such absolute honesty, such unwavering courage, such penetrating lucidity, that even after 350 years, it continues to illuminate paths that no other thinker has even glimpsed. Baruch Spinoza died in a rented room, suffocated by the glass dust he inhaled during a lifetime of manual labor. He died poor. He died alone. He died without ever having seen his masterpiece published. He died without knowing that he would become a reference for Einstein, Goethe, Hegel, Deleuze, Damasio. He died without knowing that 3.5 centuries later, someone would be telling his story to thousands of people through a technology he could not even conceive. But he died knowing something that may be worth more than any posthumous recognition. He died knowing that he had thought with honesty until the last moment, that he had not bowed down, that he had not lied, neither to others nor to himself, that he had used the mind he possessed to the extreme limit of its capacities, and that in doing so he had touched something true, something as difficult as it is rare, something we call freedom.